Hercule Poirot and the note under the dead man's pillow. Chapter 1. A Whisper Between Silk Sheets. The Darcy Mansion, located in the peaceful town of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, rose majestically on a hill overlooking the English Channel. It was one of those residences that spoke of ancient lineages, noble heritage, and secrets accumulated over generations. That September morning, the sea breeze carried with it not the usual scent of salt and seaweed, but a dense, almost oppressive silence, interrupted only by the hurried footsteps of the maid running up the stairs, her face as white as porcelain. In the East Wing, Lord Alistair Darcy, the family patriarch, had been found dead. He lay with inexplicable serenity, his hands crossed on his chest, an expression of vague surprise on his face, as if he had been visited in a dream by a truth too terrible to be spoken aloud. But it wasn't his death that shook the family. The Count was 81 years old, and in fragile health. It was the note, carefully folded and placed under his pillow, which caused the real chill. It wasn't signed, it had no address, but its contents were enough to freeze the heart of Lady Margaret, his second wife. The silence has lasted too many years. Tomorrow night I will speak. A. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, and written with a fountain pen that was no longer manufactured. No one present recognized the signature, and yet everyone, in one way or another, seemed to shudder at the thought that someone knew something. Something that shouldn't have been known. Lady Margaret, tall and stern, in her usual mourning dress that seemed more preventive than commemorative, immediately ordered the town doctor to be summoned. Dr. Vautrin arrived with his bag, examined the body, and murmured vaguely that she appeared to have had a heart attack during her sleep. But for Lady Margaret, that was not enough. Alistair didn't have any enemies, she stated, sipping her tea, her fingers trembling imperceptibly. But he did have, how do I put it, shadows around him. The local police, led by Inspector Lemoyne, took statements without much enthusiasm. The family was influential, and if an elderly man died in his bed without any signs of a struggle, why complicate matters? And the note? Lemoyne asked, his gaze distracted. A joke, said Lady Margaret. Or a warning, muttered young André Darcy, son of Lord Alistair's first marriage. It was then that Lady Margaret's niece, Miss Eloise Vernier, proposed something that would change the course of that story. There's a person, a very discreet man, Belgian, I think, whom my aunt met on a trip to London. He solves things that others don't see. Lady Margaret nodded reluctantly. Yes, Monsieur Poirot, Hercule Poirot. 3 days later, a steam train arrived at Caen station. A man of modest stature, perfectly waxed moustache, suitcase in hand, stepped off. He walked with a meticulous gait, as if the world were a chessboard, waiting for his first move. Monsieur Hercule Poirot needed no introduction. His reputation preceded him, although many mistook him for a Frenchman, something he always corrected with offended dignity. His manners were a precise balance between courtesy and authority. Well, madame, he said after the customary greetings, slightly inclining his head to Lady Margaret. What makes you think your husband didn't die of natural causes? Lady Margaret explained, with the note in hand, now protected by a white linen folder. Poirot read it twice. Then he looked Lady Margaret in the eye with a grave expression. It's not so much what he says, but when he says so. He raised an eyebrow. What if the deceased was afraid his secret would come out? What if that note wasn't a warning, but a judgment? That evening, Poirot asked to be shown the deceased's room. He observed the surroundings as if the furniture could speak, as if the dust on the dressing table had been whispering for years. He touched the bedside table. He carefully opened the drawer. He examined the pillow, the curtains, the walking stick leaning against the wall. Then he turned to the window. It was open. Did you get used to sleeping with her like that? Never. Alistair was afraid of draughts. The maid replied, lowering her gaze. Poirot gently closed the window. Then, mademoiselle, we now have a contradiction. And often it is in the small contradictions where the truth is hidden. As the moon bathed the facade of the Darcy mansion in silver, Poirot returned to his room with a blank notebook. On the first page he wrote just 3 words in large centered letters. Who is A? The investigation began, and the murderer, if there was one, did not yet know that his steps had already been measured by the most ruthless detective in Europe. Chapter 2. The shadow of the testament. The next morning dawned overcast, with low clouds that seemed to creep over the carefully manicured gardens of the Darcy mansion. At that hour, the dining room of the house was plunged into a silence barely disturbed by the soft clinking of china. No one spoke much, and eyes avoided meeting one another. Hercule Poirot ate his breakfast with meticulous slowness. A slice of lightly toasted bread, currant jam on the edge, black coffee served in a gold-rimmed cup. As he did so, he observed the faces of each member of the family. None of them looked toward the empty head of the table. "Has Lord Darcy's will been read yet?" he asked with apparent lightness, without looking up from the sugar bowl. Lady Margaret answered first, with that tone of control hardened by years of social protocol. "Not yet. According to the family's lawyer, Mr. Valfort, it will be read this afternoon. He demanded that all beneficiaries be present." Poirot nodded slowly, as if that simple piece of information confirmed a line of thought. And who will those beneficiaries be? The question, though direct, fell like a stone in a still pond. "Obviously me," Lady Margaret replied firmly, "and André, her only son." "And you, Miss Eloise?" asked Poirot, turning gently to his young niece, who had been playing nervously with her spoon. I don't know. My uncle liked me, of course, but we never talked about money." Poirot let out a slight murmur. "Ah, yes, money is never talked about, but it's always thought about." That afternoon the library became the scene of a tense ceremony. The tall, dark bookshelves formed a wall of solemn silence, and in the centre, behind a massive oak desk, Notary Valfort unfolded the documents with almost theatrical slowness. Those present were few. Lady Margaret, sitting erect as if death itself could not move her. André Darcy standing by the window, gazing toward the clipped hedges as if seeking a way out. Eloise sitting with her hands clasped and an expression of nervous anticipation. Poirot, naturally, remained in a corner, watching. The lawyer began to read. I, Alistair Robert Darcy, being of sound mind and with absolute will, declare that this is my last will and testament." The reading slid between legal formulas until reaching the neuralgic point. Lady Margaret received ownership of the mansion and a life annuity. André inherited the family's financial assets and shares. Eloise, surprisingly, was listed as the beneficiary of a considerable sum in recognition of her genuine and selfless affection. There was a murmur of surprise. But what followed next was what made everyone turn to Valfort in disbelief, and I hereby certify that, in the event that the person known as Annette, the sum of 150,000 francs will be placed at your disposal after verification of identity by the notary. The silence was absolute. Poirot looked up as if the name of a ghost had just been spoken. "Annette," he repeated softly, as if savouring the name. Lady Margaret paled slightly. "It just can't be." "Who is Annette?" asked Poirot, with strained calm. "A maid," André said with a disdainful gesture. "From many years ago. She left, or was fired, I don't remember. Wasn't that right, stepmother?" Lady Margaret narrowed her eyes. She was young, too curious for her own good. She left after an incident with a missing jewel. But that was, 25 years ago, Eloise murmured, almost without a voice. "I heard her mention it once, secretly. My mother said Annette was dangerous." Poirot approached the desk. "Mr. Valfort, are there any additional documents in the will?" The notary nodded. "An appendix. Instructions in a sealed envelope to be opened only in case this Annette shows up. It's sealed." "And meanwhile," said Poirot, staring at the Count's signature on the will, "someone who knew its contents decided to act before the truth came out." That evening Poirot walked alone through the garden. The hedges were so symmetrical, they looked as if they had been cut with an architect's ruler. In the distance, the coastal lights flickered like secrets yet to be revealed. He took out his notebook again. Under the question, "Who is A?" he added a new line. Who wanted Annette to never come back? The threads were beginning to tighten, and Poirot, a patient weaver of hidden truths, knew that the web had only just formed. Chapter 3. Interviews with the Shadow of the Garden. The next morning, with the dew still fresh on the rose bushes at the back of the Darcy mansion, Hercule Poirot began his series of private interviews. He wasn't looking for direct confessions, but for cracks in the masks. An inappropriate pause, a gesture that revealed more than the words said. Psychology, as always, was his tool of choice. He requested a table in the glass-enclosed conservatory, from where he could see both the gardens and the statues guarding the central fountain, and there he welcomed the inhabitants of the house, one by one. First, Eloise Vernier. The young woman entered dressed in a simple blouse and navy blue skirt. There was a mixture of anxiety and curiosity about her, as if she feared Poirot would see too much, but also a desire to be understood. "Miss Vernier," Poirot began softly, "when was the last time you saw Lord Darcy alive?" "The night before he died. We had dinner together, as usual. He didn't seem any different, maybe quieter than usual. But that wasn't unusual for him. And did you notice anything strange? Any mention of someone named Annette?" Eloise hesitated for a moment. "No, although," she tilted her head, "there was something. I found him staring out the window, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Were you afraid of someone, perhaps?" "Not that I knew of." Although the last few days there was a tension in the house, as if everyone knew something was coming, but no one wanted to name it. Poirot let her go with a slight bow. Then came André Darcy. He walked in with a confident air, his late father's walking-stick in his hand, as if it already belonged to him. "Monsieur Poirot," he said as he sat down, "I know you're looking for enigmas, but this isn't one. My father was old. He's dead. The note? It was probably a trick by someone trying to sow doubt for the sake of money. And don't you think the appearance of that name in the will indicates something else?" André frowned. "Annette was a servant, nothing more. What she did decades ago has no relevance today. The important thing is that the legacy was clear." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Funny that you remember so little about her, and yet with such disdain. Did you have any conflicts with her? André has a rigid pussy. I was 12 when he left. What kind of conflict would I have?" Poirot didn't reply. He just jotted something down in his notebook before dismissing him. The third was Lady Margaret. She entered with sober elegance, her lace gloves still on, as if social protocol did not cease even in the face of death. "I'm afraid, Monsieur Poirot, you're looking too deeply into shadows. Alistair died in his bed. What more proof do you need?" "A simple question, madam. Who is Annette to you?" Lady Margaret looked down for a second. Barely a second, but Poirot noticed. "An insolent young woman who thought the house belonged to her," he said finally. "Alistair had a soft heart. She took advantage of that. She was quietly dismissed to avoid scandal." "Scandals?" "She was too close to certain family members." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Members? Plural. I don't speculate, sir. I just clear the tracks of those who don't know where their boundaries end." Later, Poirot asked to speak to the maid, Mademoiselle Claire, who had been the first to find the body. He was young, with quick eyes and a frightened expression. "Did you open the bedroom window that night?" "No, monsieur." Lord Darcy always said that sleeping with the window open was inviting death. Then someone opened it after of his death. Claire swallowed. "I saw someone walk down the hall that night. I thought it was Mr. André, but I didn't get a good look at him. What time is it? I couldn't say, maybe around midnight." Poirot nodded slowly. When evening fell, Poirot discreetly retired to his room. He placed a blank sheet of paper on his desk and wrote 4 names with his fountain pen: Eloise, André, Margaret, Claire. Below, 1 word, reason, and, next to it, another one, fear. Then he wrote a new line. Who benefited from Annette's silence? Night was beginning to fall on the Darcy mansion, but for Poirot, the shadows were only just beginning to reveal their secrets. Chapter 4. A Name Engraved in Silver. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered timidly through the stained-glass windows of the east corridor, Hercule Poirot was leaning over the library desk, examining with scrupulous care a silver salver that had been discreetly removed from the late Lord Darcy's room. It wasn't a piece of great artistic value, but it was certainly ancient, hand-engraved on its inner rim, almost hidden by reflections, was a short, carefully executed inscription, A.A., for the years we will never forget. Poirot touched the inscription with the tip of his finger, as if trying to sense the past. Contained within those letters, it wasn't just any gift, she murmured. It was personal, emotional, and clearly predated Lord Darcy's second marriage. The housekeeper, Madame Dupin, watched him from the doorway. It was discovered by Mrs. Margaret 2 nights ago, in the cupboard where the family's old belongings are kept, he explained. She found it wrapped in velvet along with some letters that, as I understand it, have disappeared. Missing? Repeated Poirot, turning around immediately. And who knew about the existence of that tray? Just Lady Margaret and, well, possibly young André. He was present when she found her. He seemed uncomfortable. Poirot made a note in his notebook. A.A., an unknown Annette, and an Alistair who, it seemed, hadn't forgotten her as much as they'd pretended. He decided not to question anyone further for the time being. Instead, he requested permission to inspect the mansion's north wing, the one that had been least used for years. It was a place that smelled of confinement, damp wood, and forgotten papers. There, he found a closed-off sewing room, a music room that barely retained an out-of-tune piano, and a locked bedroom. Lady Margaret handed him the key with a sigh. It was Alistair's private study. No one has been in there for years. Poirot cautiously opened the door. The room was narrow, with a high window and dark furniture covered with sheets. The air was thick with dust and memory. On the desk, under a glass pane stained by time, lay old photographs. One showed Lord Darcy in military uniform. Another showed him younger, alongside a woman with a serene face and coiled hair. It wasn't Lady Margaret. Poirot leaned forward, looking into the woman's eyes. "Annette," he whispered. But what caught his attention wasn't the photo, but the frame. Engraved on the wooden base, almost erased by the years, was the following. A&A, Spring 1908. The handwriting matched the one on the tray. The same romantic antique, cursive, impersonal in appearance, but deeply intimate. Poirot returned to his notebook and wrote, "Past relationship, hidden evidence, reason to remain silent." Back in the living room, the detective found Eloise sitting reading a novel without turning a page. Seeing her, he looked up with a mixture of expectation and fear. "Mademoiselle, may I confide in you an observation?" "Of course, Monsieur Poirot." "You mentioned that your mother spoke of Annette as a dangerous presence. Do you think she meant that in a moral sense, or more as a threat to the stability of this household?" Eloise hesitated. "I think," she finally said, "it was both. I always suspected there was something more between Annette and my uncle, something forbidden. My mother believed Margaret had made her disappear." Poirot leaned towards her, his moustache flashing in the midday light. Disappear? Like someone firing a maid? Or like someone making an obstacle disappear? Eloise paled. "My mother never said it clearly, but sometimes she spoke in whispers, as if she were afraid the house itself would hear her." Poirot stood up with a grave gesture. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You've said more than you realize." That night, Poirot locked himself in his room. He took out 3 objects, the photograph, the tray, and a copy of the will. He placed them on the table like chess pieces. He assigned each a word: photo, origin, tray, link, testament, threat. And then, without lifting his pen, he wrote a preliminary hypothesis. Annette was more than a servant. She was a lover, perhaps the mother of a hidden child, and her return, or even the mention of it, threatened the line of succession. He rested his chin on his interlaced fingers. The motive is old, but the crime? The crime is recent, and it remains to be seen who feared Annette's return the most. The night covered the mansion with a blanket of secrets, and Poirot, his little grey cells burning with deduction, knew that the past had not only returned, it was beginning to collect its debt. Chapter 5. The Confession That Wasn't a Mistake. Morning dawned with a dense fog covering the garden, like a veil of unrevealed secrets. Hercule Poirot, punctual as the pendulum of a Swiss watch, ordered a cup of hot chocolate and retired to the second-floor gallery, from where he could watch the comings and goings of the employees without being seen. That morning he wasn't walking, he wasn't questioning, he was observing. I knew that silence spoke volumes, and today's silence was tense, as if the whole house were holding its breath. It was around noon when Mademoiselle Claire, the maid, appeared with swollen eyes and trembling lips. She was holding a letter folded in four. Monsieur Poirot, I don't know if this matters, but I think I must show it to you. Poirot invited her to sit down. He opened the letter carefully. The ink was old, already faded in places, but the handwriting was clear, precise, and emotional. I couldn't say it in life, and now I fear it's too late. What happened that night was my fault. I allowed her to leave. I believed it was best for everyone. But I was wrong. If she ever returns, I pray she will not be punished. I loved her, and I was cowardly enough to keep quiet about that truth. Poirot read the letter twice, then fixed his gaze on the young woman. Where did you find it? At the bottom of Mr. Darcy's dresser drawer. It was under his linen handkerchief. I didn't show it to anyone else. It seemed private, but also important. You did well. Poirot folded the letter with the same delicacy with which a priest guards a relic. This letter is not a confession of murder, but it is of cowardice. And cowardice, mademoiselle, has consequences as long as shadows in the evening. That same day, Poirot requested a private meeting with Monsieur Valfort, the notary. He received him in the closed office, amidst bound documents and the musty smell of old paper. Mr. Valfort, I need to know if there has been any recent attempt to modify the will. The notary frowned in surprise. Indeed, a few weeks ago Lord Darcy wrote to me requesting an urgent meeting. He wanted to add a name. He said it was someone from his past. He didn't give me any further details, but he sounded excited, almost relieved. And did that meeting take place? No, it was cancelled. 3 days later, I received a letter from Lord Darcy himself, telling me he'd reconsidered. But the note smacked of coercion, if I may say so. It wasn't his usual style. Do you keep it? Valfort rummaged through his files and with a tired smile pulled out a small envelope. Poirot read the note. Just 6 words. Leave everything as it is. A.D. Too short, said Poirot, and written with a different pen. He looked at the line again. Lighter, less firm, perhaps imitated. Who had access to your personal papers? Only Lady Margaret. And perhaps Hercule Poirot noted again. The cancellation of the change, was it forced? In the middle of the afternoon, Poirot was walking among the sculptures in the garden when Eloise hurriedly caught up with him. Monsieur Poirot, I remembered something. Perhaps it means nothing. Mademoiselle, in an investigation, what seems like nothing is often something disguised. 2 nights ago, shortly after dinner, I saw Lady Margaret come down to the north wing. She was carrying something wrapped in a blanket. I didn't see what it was, but it was strange. She never goes down there alone. Never. Poirot nodded. Thank you. Your memory, like your intuition, should not be underestimated. That night, Poirot locked himself in his room with his notes. He turned on the desk lamp and reviewed the objects on his table. The engraved tray, the love letter Claire had found, the studio photograph, and the forged will note. An invisible line connected each of them, and Poirot began to draw it with mathematical precision. Lord Darcy wanted to include Annette in the will. 2. He changed his mind, or was forced to change. 3. He died before Annette could speak, but someone knew she was planning to do so. 4. The motive, to prevent a blood secret from coming to light. Poirot looked up at the oval mirror that hung opposite his desk. A confession is not always a mistake, he muttered to himself. Sometimes it's an act of courage that comes too late. He put the letter in a new envelope, sealed it, and wrote, "Only open in the presence of all those involved." The last piece hadn't fallen yet, but the circle was closing, and Poirot, with a calmness that only those who already know the truth can give, knew that very soon he would gather everyone together to open the doors of the past wide open. Chapter 6. The Voice of the Broken Picture. It was barely dawn when a muffled scream broke the silence of the Darcy mansion. It came from the second-floor gallery. The maid, Claire, pale as wax, stood by the wall where the family portraits hung. One of them, the oval portrait of Lord Alistair Darcy, painted in his younger years, now lay on the floor, its frame shattered, its glass shattered. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing. Upon removing the canvas from the floor, Claire and the housekeeper discovered something else. Behind the torn fabric, glued to the inside of the frame, was a small sheet of aged paper, hidden between the support and the frame. Poirot arrived at the scene just a few minutes later. He examined the scene with his usual precision, bending down to look at the back of the portrait. This isn't vandalism, mes amis. It's revelation. He touched the paper with his gloved fingers, as if removing a bandage. Someone knew about this note and wanted to recover it or destroy it. He carefully unfolded the paper. The ink was faded but legible. It read, "The truth can't be buried forever. If anything happens to me, look for the letter Annette left in 1909. She knew I wouldn't have the courage, but you must know." Signed, Eddie Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. A premonition, or a warning postponed for too many years. Shortly afterwards, Poirot asked to review Lord Darcy's personal archive, particularly the letters from 1909. The housekeeper led him to the South Wing office, where family papers were stored in boxes numbered by decade. With the patience of a librarian, Poirot removed boxes, sifted through correspondence, banknotes, and receipts. Finally, in a torn folder, he found a letter without an envelope, written in a passionate feminine hand. "Alistair, if you choose silence, I will leave. Not out of shame, but out of fear of what they might do to me. You have promised to protect us, and yet I am forced to flee. I cannot stay knowing that Margaret has discovered me. She already warned me. A woman like you has no place in this house. But remember this. I am taking neither gold nor title, only our son. He will know who his father was, and one day, perhaps, we will return." Poirot read it silently, twice, before putting it away in his folder. His face was more serious than ever. There you go. The secret wasn't love, it was blood. Late in the afternoon, Poirot asked everyone to gather in the main drawing room. Lady Margaret, André, Eloise, and Claire sat down, each with a different expression: impatience, distrust, fear. Poirot entered with the letter in his hand and the broken portrait behind him, already mounted on a side table. "My lords and ladies," he began, "I have discovered what Lord Darcy wanted to hide and what, in the end, someone wanted to destroy." Everyone remained silent. Poirot took Annette's letter and placed it on the central table. Mr. Darcy didn't die alone, a sick old man. He died tormented by the cowardice of a silence that protected others more than himself. Annette wasn't just any servant. She was his lover, and more than that, she was the mother of his child. A dull murmur ran through the room. "What are you insinuating, Poirot?" Lady Margaret snapped, her voice thick with poison. "I'm not implying, I'm stating. This letter, written in 1909 and hidden within the frame of his own portrait, confirms it. The son's name isn't specified, but someone here knew or suspected of his existence. And when they learned that Annette or her descendant might reclaim what was theirs, the urgency to protect what was established turned to desperation." André stood up, indignant. "Are you suggesting that one of us killed my father?" "I'm saying someone silenced him. Maybe not with poison or a knife, but with pressure, manipulation, or fear. Lord Darcy retracted his will, not of his own volition, but because he was coerced." Eloise looked up, pale. "What if that son has already returned?" Everyone turned to her. "What if he's already here?" Between us, Poirot looked at her with a twinkle in his eyes. "Mademoiselle, your hypothesis isn't far-fetched. Perhaps he doesn't even know it himself. Perhaps that's exactly what someone else feared." That night, Poirot retired to his room and spread all the documents on his bed. The torn portrait, Annette's letter, Lord Darcy's note, the cancelled will, and the letter Claire had rescued. Then he jotted down a key phrase: "Murder without a weapon is the most elegant of all, and the cruelest." The killer hadn't needed poison, just information. Just a truth too heavy to let out. But now that he had discovered her, there was only one thing left: to expose her. And for that, Poirot would prepare the most precise scene of all, the final meeting. Chapter 7. The Game of Silence and Blood. The next day dawned motionless, as if time itself had decided to pause and observe what was about to happen. At the Darcy mansion, the inhabitants moved cautiously, each word spoken carrying the weight of an echo, as if the truth itself hung in the air, waiting to be unmasked. Poirot, always impeccable in his appearance and meticulously punctual, headed to the music room, where he had requested a round table be set up. On it he placed 5 objects: the damaged portrait of Lord Darcy, the silver salver with the hidden inscription, the love letter signed by Annette, the original will, and the intercepted letter that never reached the notary. Symbols of the past, evidence of the present. At 11 o'clock sharp, the summoned party appeared: Lady Margaret, André, Eloise, Claire, and Notary Valfort. They all sat down with expressions ranging from tension, impatience, and fear. Poirot remained standing. "My friends, let me explain what I've already understood. Mr. Darcy, in his old age, wanted to do justice. He wanted to acknowledge a woman he had loved, and perhaps a son whose existence was kept in the shadows. But the weight of that decision, or rather, the fear it aroused in others, ultimately sealed his fate." "Are you saying he was murdered?" Lady Margaret interrupted with icy coldness. "I'm saying he was silenced. Not necessarily with venom or violence, but with emotional pressure, blackmail, perhaps even fear." Poirot paused, looking from one to another. When he retracted his intention to change the will, he didn't do so freely. He did so because someone among you convinced him that speaking out would be dangerous. Silence fell like a blanket. "And not only that," Poirot continued, "that person also sought to erase all traces of Annette, her letters, her memory, and, ultimately, her legacy. Why? Because the return of that woman, or worse, that of her son, threatened to dismantle the carefully constructed structure of this family." André hit the back of his chair. "This is absurd. What if it's all a coincidence? An old man with remorse, a missing maid, a forgotten letter. And an accidentally torn portrait reveals a note with precise instructions? No, Monsieur Darcy, chance isn't that precise." Poirot bowed slightly. "You knew your father wanted to change the will. How did you know?" André paled. "I didn't know anything. Are you sure? Or were you the one who forged the note cancelling your modification? Did you write it using a different pen and your signature as a template? That's an accusation without evidence." "Certainly, for now," Poirot replied. "But the interesting thing is not what you did, but what you didn't do. Because if you were the illegitimate son, you would never have feared Annette's return. You would have desired it. But you fear her. I saw it in your eyes." Poirot turned to Lady Margaret. "You, on the other hand, did know. You saw Annette as a threat from the beginning. You made her disappear years ago. And when you discovered Lord Darcy was planning to bring her back, you acted. You found the letter in the portrait. Perhaps you tried to destroy it, but you were too late." Lady Margaret didn't speak. She just raised her chin with broken dignity. "And yet, mes amis, you're not the most important ones right now. The real mystery is who that son is. Where is he? Does he even know who he is?" Poirot turned slowly towards Claire. "Mademoiselle Claire, have you ever wondered why your mother, before she died, asked you to come work here?" The young woman opened her eyes in surprise. My mother? Yes, Annette, the woman you met as a seamstress in Lille. She never said her father was Lord Darcy, but she sent you here, with a letter in hand, which you never dared deliver, because she was afraid of what she would find. Am I wrong? Claire brought a hand to her mouth. She told me I'd know the truth here, but I didn't know what it meant. I didn't think. Poirot looked at her gently. I wasn't looking for a fortune. I just wanted to know who you were. And your mother, afraid but also hopeful, sent you back to the place where it all began. For a few moments, no one spoke. Claire sank into her chair, as if the floor had opened up beneath her feet. André seemed a ghost of himself. Lady Margaret, motionless, denied nothing. Poirot closed his notebook. The crime, my friends, wasn't just against one person. It was against the truth. And that, sometimes, is the most unforgivable of all. He turned to Villefort. Annette's letter. The one from 1909. You must add it to the file, not for the money, but for justice. The notary nodded, his expression solemn. So it shall be. As night fell, Poirot went for a walk in the garden, now enveloped in a less oppressive silence. The shadows no longer whispered secrets, but seemed to be resting. From the gallery, Claire watched him. She held her mother's letter in her hand, and for the first time she wasn't afraid of what it might contain. Poirot stopped, looking at the sky. Order has been restored, he murmured to himself. But the human heart, that never ceases to be a labyrinth. Chapter 8. A Footprint in the Shadow of Time. That dawn arrived with a different air. The wind blowing off the sea was warmer, and the lace curtains in Poirot's room danced softly, as if the mansion itself were breathing more freely. And yet the Belgian detective knew there were still shadows to dispel. The most important thing, the crime itself, had not yet been fully solved. Lord Alistair Darcy did not die of simple old age. That was clear to Poirot, but the most complex question was not how, but the exact who and why. Was it an emotional threat that led to his collapse? Or did someone precipitate his end in a more subtle way? Poirot again requested access to the deceased's office. He wasn't looking for documents anymore, but for something more delicate, inconsistencies. He began by examining the medicine bottles. He lined them up by size, then by prescription date. One detail caught his eye. A bottle of heart pills, newly issued, had the Count's name on it. But the dosage was higher than the one prescribed the previous month. Too strong for a man of his age, Poirot murmured. He called Dr. Vautrin. Doctor, were you the one who prescribed this medicine? The doctor examined the bottle. No, this is a more aggressive formula. I had adjusted the dosage precisely to avoid stressing the Count's heart. But this would have accelerated his heart rate. In his condition, it could have caused him to go into cardiac arrest. Poirot nodded slowly. The chemical clue had finally emerged, not a poison, but a manipulated dose, covered with the appearance of legitimate treatment. Who had access to your personal medicine cabinet? Mrs. Margaret, the doctor replied without hesitation. She insisted on monitoring her medication. Poirot wrote in his notebook, it wasn't violence, it was choice. Later, Poirot found Claire in the greenhouse, still holding her mother's letter. "Monsieur Poirot, do you really think I'm his daughter?" "Mademoiselle, I don't think so. See, and I also know that your mother feared history would repeat itself, that you would be used, marginalized, or punished for the sin of existing. But the sin wasn't yours. It was the sin of silence." Claire burst into soft tears. "And what will happen now? You have the right to the truth, and to decide what to do with it." Poirot looked at her tenderly. "A name doesn't define a person, but justice sometimes heals invisible wounds." At dusk, Poirot asked to speak to Lady Margaret once more. He found her in her room in front of the mirror, slowly combing her hair. Her face was pale, but serene. "I knew you'd come," he said without turning around. "You were the one who changed the dosage. You didn't need to lie or get your hands dirty. You just adjusted what was already inevitable. But that doesn't make it any less calculated." Lady Margaret put the brush on the table. "It wasn't out of hate. It was out of fear. Annette's return would have destroyed everything I fought for, everything I protected, this home, this family. No." Poirot shook his head gently. "You were protecting your pride, madam, not your family, and in your determination to preserve it, you erased the last chance of redemption for a man who had already paid with decades of silence." Margaret stood up slowly, without crying. "Are you going to hand me over?" "No, I'm not a judge. I'm a man who seeks the truth. But others will decide. Claire already knows enough. The notary too. And justice, madame, has many forms." Lady Margaret nodded, her lips pursed. "In the end, no one wins, right, Monsieur Poirot?" "No, madame, but sometimes it saves others from losing more." That evening, Poirot walked along the gravel path surrounding the estate's artificial lake. The mansion's lights were reflected in the water, distorted by the ripples, as if even the newly revealed truth needed time to sink in. Poirot stopped, took out his pocket watch, and looked at it for a few seconds. Life, my friend, is a succession of misaligned clocks. Some move forward, others move back, but they all tick, sooner or later, the exact moment. And with that, he headed back inside the house. I knew there was still one final scene left, the full reveal in front of everyone involved. The pieces were in place, and Thesmal grey cells were ready to deliver their masterstroke. Chapter 9. The Final Meeting in the Library. Night fell upon the Darcy mansion with an unusually thick silence, as if even the wind refused to interrupt the inevitable. In the library, beneath the large grandfather clock that solemnly ticked away each second, the chairs were arranged in a semicircle. In the centre, standing with his hands crossed over his stomach, Hercule Poirot waited. Little by little, the guests arrived. Lady Margaret, wrapped in a dark velvet robe, wore the expression of someone who knew she had nothing left to hide. André, tense and sharp, sat in a corner, his eyes never leaving Claire, who arrived accompanied by the notary Valfort. Eloise, silent, remained in the shadow of a bookcase, like another observer. When the clock struck 8, Poirot spoke. "My lords and ladies, thank you for coming. As you know, the purpose of this gathering isn't social. It's about revealing the truth. a truth that has lain dormant for more than 20 years, and that, like all badly buried secrets, has finally come to light." He paused, then gestured elegantly toward the objects arranged on the table: the inscribed silver tray, the studio photograph, Annette's letter, and the forged will. Lord Alistair Darcy died, yes, but not of natural causes. He died burdened by a truth that others would not allow him to confess. In his final days, he sought to correct the greatest mistake of his life: silence. He wanted to acknowledge the woman he loved, and perhaps the son that woman raised alone. His death was not a coincidence. It was induced, though without visible violence, by the emotional and pharmacological manipulation of those who feared that such an acknowledgment would destroy their privileges. Their eyes began to cross like knives. "Mrs. Margaret Darcy," Poirot continued quietly, "was the one who altered the dosage of her husband's heart medicine. She didn't kill him with a knife. She made a choice. She denied him the possibility of redemption, disguising it as familial protection. But what she was really protecting was the family name, the coat of arms, and above all, her place in this house." Lady Margaret, sitting stiffly, didn't protest. She just looked away, holding on to her pride like an invisible cane. Mr. André Darcy forged a note to prevent the will from being changed. He feared losing everything, and in doing so, he contributed to his father's final isolation. Didn't kill him, but it pushed him one step closer to the abyss. The fear of scandal, the fear of sharing the inheritance. André jumped up. "I didn't know. I thought it was just an old obsession. I didn't think that. I didn't kill him. Perhaps not. But truth, monsieur, rarely dies with a single blow. It's usually killed slowly among many. With indifference, with greed, with pride." Poirot now turned to Claire. The young woman was trembling. "And you, Mademoiselle Claire, are the heir to the greatest silence of all. Your mother, Annette, didn't just disappear. She was cast out, rejected, condemned by a decision you both, she and Alistair, made in your youth. You came here without knowing everything, with a letter in your hand you never dared to deliver. But even in your silence, your very presence stirred the ghosts of the past." Claire, her voice barely audible, murmured, "And what am I then? A threat? Living proof?" Poirot bowed gently towards her. "No, mademoiselle, you are an opportunity. For justice, for balance, for righting what went wrong. Mr. Darcy wanted to make amends, and although he was kept quiet, his will remained written, hidden in letters, in forgotten objects, in whispers trapped in the frames of portraits." Turning to Valfort, Poirot concluded, "I've submitted all the relevant documents to the notary. Letters, dates, writings, and signatures. Mr. Darcy tried to change his will. His will was blocked, yes, but it was also registered, and now it can be properly executed." The notary nodded solemnly. "Legally, there's sufficient grounds to consider your ultimate intentions valid, especially if Miss Claire wishes to claim her share." Claire looked down, then, after a pause, looked up with unexpected serenity. "I don't want the fortune," he said. "I just wanted to know who he was. Now I know." A deep silence enveloped the library. Poirot closed his notebook with a ceremonious gesture. So, mes amis, the truth has been revealed. There is no applause, no loud punishments, only consequences. Everyone will know how to live with them. That evening, Poirot went for one last walk in the gardens. The air was lighter, though still heavy with echoes. When he reached the central fountain, he stopped. He looked at his reflection in the water. Sometimes crimes don't leave bloodstains, just cracks in the soul. He took out his pocket watch, opened it, and looked at the exact time. There you go, everything is in order. Tomorrow he would leave Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. But tonight, as the grandfather clock struck midnight, Hercule Poirot knew that justice, in its own way, had spoken. Chapter 10. Outcome. The last echo of silence. The morning after the revelation, the Darcy mansion awoke to a profound calm, unlike the tension that had suffocated it for days. It wasn't serenity. It was a form of silent resignation, as if the walls themselves had finally accepted the truth they had held back for decades. Claire walked alone along the gravel path leading to the greenhouse. The sky was grey, but with no threat of rain. The garden smelled of damp earth and freshly opened flowers. In one hand, she carried her mother's letter. In the other, a small carved wooden box that Poirot had given her that morning. Inside, carefully folded, was a photograph. A sepia-toned picture of Lord Darcy and Annette, young, smiling, their eyes full of promises that would never be fulfilled. On the back, in shaky but firm handwriting, someone had written, "What could not be still lives in the one who was the fruit of it." Claire closed the box. His fate remained uncertain, but he was no longer lost. He knew who he was, and that knowledge belonged to him, not as a weapon, nor as an inheritance, but as a root. In the drawing-room, Poirot was finalizing the preparations for his departure. His luggage, modest as ever, was already laid out by the front door. As he was buttoning his coat, Eloise appeared on the threshold. "Is it a march, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oui, mademoiselle, I'm no longer needed. The crime has been understood, and justice, however subtle, has been sown." Eloise looked at him with a hint of melancholy. "And do you think anything will change? That Lady Margaret will regret it? That André will stop clinging to the name?" Poirot tilted his head with a slight smile. "I don't know. The truth doesn't transform everyone. Sometimes it just illuminates, and each person decides whether to open their eyes or remain in the darkness." Lady Margaret didn't come down to say goodbye. She remained in her room, staring at her husband's photograph with an unreadable expression. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But a single tear fell, silently and thickly, onto the white handkerchief she held in her lap. Maybe it wasn't guilt, she felt, but loss. Not of the man, but of the image she'd built to survive at his side. An image that was now crumbling like old plaster, revealing the fragility of everything she'd tried to control. Before leaving, Poirot walked one last time, through the north wing now devoid of its ghostly burden. He stopped in front of Lord Darcy's study. The door was ajar. Inside, the now-repaired portrait of the Count hung again on the wall. But something had changed. On the desk, framed in glass, was Annette's letter, not as an affront, but as an act. of recognition, not hidden, not destroyed, displayed. Poirot bowed slightly to her. "Madam, your words didn't come in time in life, but you found justice in death, and that, believe me, is no small feat. At the train station, with the locomotive already smoking, Poirot climbed into his carriage with slow movements. He settled himself by the window and took out his pocket watch, opening it with a mechanical gesture. Exactly 12 o'clock. Punctuality, order, and balance, he muttered. A child waiting on the platform with his mother looked at him curiously. Poirot gave him a smile and an elegant wave of his hat. Then he closed his eyes for a moment, as if mentally reviewing all the steps of the dance he had just directed. The glances, the omissions, the pieces moved one by one on that board of family lies. As the train began to move forward, Poirot opened his eyes again. "The hardest murder to solve," he said quietly, "isn't the one that leaves a body, but the one that leaves a void. A silence where a confession should have been. A place in memory where someone was precisely erased, until memory itself demands their return." The landscape began to slide more quickly past the window. The mansion, invisible behind the trees, was left behind. But the echo of the crime would continue to resonate for a long time in the halls of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. Not as an accusation, but as a necessary reminder. Because in the end, as Poirot knew very well, justice doesn't always punish. Sometimes it simply awakens. Chapter 11. Epilogue. Echoes beneath the surface. 6 months have passed since Hercule Poirot left Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer on the 12 o'clock train. The Darcy mansion remains standing, majestic and silent, but something has changed. The walls no longer resonate with the whispers of the past, and the rooms, once heavy with secrets, have begun to breathe with a different, lighter, but not forgotten stillness. Claire Vernier, once nothing more than a maid with an undelivered letter, has become more than the hidden heir to the Darcy lineage. She has decided not to claim the family name or the fortune, but has accepted a small house on the edge of town, the same one where Annette once lived before quietly leaving. There she has set up a small community library with the discreet support of Monsieur Valfort. A place for memory, for recovered truths. Every morning, Claire waters the bushes outside her door and greets the mailman with a warm smile. No one calls her Miss Darcy, but everyone looks at her with a newfound respect, as if they know, without her needing to say it, that inside her lives a story that no longer needs to be hidden. Lady Margaret still lives at the mansion, although she rarely receives visitors. The formal salons have been closed, the servants have been reduced, and her figure no longer wanders the gardens as it once did. She is sometimes seen by the fireplace, writing unsent letters, or playing the piano in the evenings, her hands slowly repeating the same melodies. Her relationship with André has cooled. He's gone to Paris to take over a secondary family business, without saying much goodbye. Perhaps he's realized deep down that a family name isn't enough when blood has been denied. One mild spring morning, a letter arrived at Claire's house. The envelope was thick, cream-coloured paper, bearing the letterhead of a London hotel. It wasn't signed, but Claire recognized the handwriting with a pang of emotion. "Mademoiselle, I've thought about you a lot since I left. The world keeps turning, and one gets used to seeing cases where justice arrives with handcuffs and sentences. But there are cases like yours, where justice is more subtle, more humane. I passed through Saint-Omer recently, and I thought about your mother, about her courage, about her silence, about her choice to protect everything through forgetting. Not all legacies are inherited in wills. Some are cultivated, read and shared, like the books you collect now. I don't need to tell you to take care of yourself. You'll do it. I won't tell you to forget either. Forgetting is a form of betrayal, isn't it? I'll just tell you that it was an honor to meet you. H.P. Claire put the letter in the wooden box that also held her parents' photograph. She sat by the window, holding the first copy in her library, an old edition of The Secret Garden, with a worn cover and bent corners. And as I read, the coastal wind blew softly across the rooftops, as if it were finally carrying the words that were never spoken to a place where they could rest. In London, Hercule Poirot walked down Whitehall with a short but firm stride, his coat perfectly ironed, his walking stick aligned with the sidewalk. He had just rejected a new case, a murder in an art gallery, because he considered it too noisy. Nothing interesting for the grey areas, he had said. He stopped in front of an antique watch shop. He noticed one in particular, a pocket watch almost identical to the one Lord Darcy had worn. "Time," he said softly. "Sometimes fear accelerates it. Sometimes regret stops it, but it always reveals everything." He took out his own watch, compared it to the one in the display case, and smiled. "And always, always, it marks the truth." Poirot continued on his way, leaving the reflection behind like a weightless shadow. Justice, for him, was not just a matter of laws. It was, and always would be, a point of order. Chapter 12. Grey Cells Don't Rest. 2 weeks after his return to London, Hercule Poirot found himself in his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, meticulously aligning the objects on his desk. Every sheet of paper, every fountain pen, even the angle of the inkwell was placed with mathematical precision. Outside, it was drizzling, and the rhythmic sound of the drops on the window-sill seemed to accompany his thoughts like a silent orchestra. He was absorbed, not in a new case, but in mentally reconstructing the previous one. It wasn't his habit to dwell on the past, but the affair of Miss Claire Vernier and the death of Lord Darcy had left a particular impression, not so much because of the crime itself, but because of the invisible wounds that slowly revealed themselves beneath the surface. His reflection was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Please come in." The door opened, revealing his faithful friend, Captain Hastings, recently returned from Argentina. He was wearing a soaked coat, a hat in his hand, and the same expression of bewilderment and excitement that Poirot knew well. "My friend," exclaimed Poirot, rising. "What a pleasant surprise! How was your voyage through the southern hemisphere?" Hastings slumped into a chair. "Long and boring. But as soon as I arrived at the port, I learned you'd solved another of your unspeakable mysteries in the French countryside. A will. A missing maid." Poirot smiled slightly. "All that and more. A bloodless crime, but with deep traces. And it ended well?" It ended justly, Hastings, which isn't always the same as punishment. That evening, as they shared hot chocolate, Poirot spread a copy of Lord Darcy's will on the table, along with a sheet of notes. Hastings watched him with growing curiosity. "Are you still reviewing the case?" "I'm closing it," Poirot replied firmly, "but there's one detail that continues to puzzle me." "Oh? Annette's letter. The real one. The one about her son. It was written in 1909. And yet the accompanying documents were placed in the studio. Portrait, much later. The fibres on the back of the frame were manipulated with modern tools. That means someone else. He found it years later. And he hid it again." Hastings frowned. "And you think that?" "I don't think all the threads have been cut. Claire Vernier is safe, yes. But there's someone else, someone still unknown, who played with the puzzle pieces before I arrived, someone who knew about Claire's origins. And chose to remain silent for a reason I still don't understand. An accomplice?" Poirot shook his head slightly. "Not necessarily. Maybe a witness. Maybe even a second heir." Hastings sat up, excitement blazing on his face. "So there's still a loose end." Poirot smiled, satisfied. "Exactly, mon ami. And that means the grey cells still have work to do." The following morning, Poirot sent a letter to Monsieur Valfort, the notary of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, discreetly requesting access to the notarial archives from 1910. In particular, records of births out of wedlock or covert adoptions carried out by third parties under secondary surnames. The reply arrived 5 days later, with a small sealed package. Inside, a note. "Mr. Poirot, I found a document that might interest you. It was filed under a different name, but it bears the unmistakable signature of Lord Alistair Darcy. I attach a copy. Valfort." Poirot opened the sheet with slow hands. It was a maintenance contract, dated March 1910. The addressee was H.L., a woman of modest origins who lived in Amiens. H.L., Poirot murmured. Another woman, or an accomplice? The document described a monthly sum for the care of a child, identified only by initials. E.D., not Claire. Another child. Another Darcy! Hastings looked at him, astonished. So there was another son, or at least someone who was recorded as such. But why did that child disappear from the trail? And why keep him hidden even after Alistair's death? Poirot closed the document and looked up. Because maybe, Hastings, someone else is still protecting a secret. And secrets, as you well know, are fertile ground for crime. So, as London continued its relentless pace under the April rain, Poirot began to feel that slight pressure behind his eyes again, an unmistakable sign. A new story was unfolding before him, not with noise, but with the subtle murmur of a still-buried truth. The pieces were not complete, and when that happened, Hercule Poirot did not rest. Chapter 13. The Silenced File in Amiens. 2 weeks later, Hercule Poirot found himself in the northern French city of Amiens. The leaden sky and cobblestone streets gave the city a melancholy air that suited his purpose perfectly. To discover the identity of the child identified as E.D. on the contract signed by Lord Alistair Darcy in 1910. Accompanied by Captain Hastings, who insisted on accompanying him even though he disliked the northern cold. Poirot walked towards the old Civil Archives building. It stood next to a black stone church and was guarded by 2 columns corroded by damp. Inside, the aisles were lined with tall shelves of files, bound books, and dusty records. Poirot headed to the main counter, Valfour's letter in his hand. "Sir, we've come to consult the birth and guardianship records for the year 1910. Specifically, cases of legal support or adoption under a proxy." The archivist, a man with a nasal voice and a bored expression, frowned. "They're not publicly accessible, sir, unless you have a court order." Poirot discreetly slipped Valfour a business card, along with a letter signed by the notary's office in Caen. The official snorted, but agreed. After a few minutes, he disappeared among the shelves, returning with a folder labelled Private Contracts, 1910. Poirot opened it with careful hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, added in pencil, as if it had been corrected later. The document was a copy of the familiar contract, but this time the miner's full name was visible: Henri Dubois, born March 4th, 1910. Mother, Hélène Lemoine. Father, undisclosed. Poirot stood still. Lemoine, he repeated slowly. That last name? Hastings looked up. Does this sound familiar? Of course I've heard of him. The police inspector in Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer is named Lemoine. Himself? It can't be a coincidence. Poirot closed the folder with a sharp click. Hastings, we have to return to Normandy. The circle wasn't completely closed, because one of those closing it from within was a blood relative. Back in Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, Poirot requested a private meeting with Inspector Lemoine. He found him in his small municipal office, a modest but tidy place, where each report was carefully filed. "Monsieur Poirot," said Lemoine with restrained kindness, "I didn't expect to see you again." "Nor do I, Inspector," replied Poirot. "But it turns out we're not finished. I've come to ask you a very simple question. Did you know a woman named Hélène Lemoine?" The inspector's face tensed slightly. It was a fleeting gesture, but it was enough. "It was my mother. And you knew a man named Alistair Darcy?" "Of course. The whole town knew him. What's he trying to do?" Poirot interlaced his fingers on the table. "I don't want to get there. I've already arrived. You are the illegitimate son of Lord Darcy, and you've known it all your life. Perhaps not from your mother, who protected your dignity, but from a hidden piece of paper, a letter, or perhaps a late confession." Lemoine took a deep breath. Then he finally spoke. "I found out when I was 16. I found a letter among my mother's things after she died. It told me the truth, but it also asked me one thing, that I never ask for anything back. And so he did. Yes, I became a police officer. I worked hard. And when I was assigned to this town, I knew fate was playing its cruelest trick. I never wanted to be near it, but I didn't dare leave either." Poirot looked at him gravely. "And when he died, did it seem right to bury everything again?" "I didn't kill him, Poirot. I never spoke to him. I never entered the mansion. I just watched, like an involuntary witness." Poirot stood up. "So, you're the second heir. Legitimate by blood, though, not by recognition. But unlike Claire, you chose to remain silent. The Darcy name already carried too much weight. I didn't want to carry it." Poirot nodded respectfully. Then, as he left the office, he muttered to himself, "2 children, one raised in the shadows without knowing it, the other knowing, and choosing not to complain. And in the middle, a mansion full of people who believed themselves heirs to order, and not to the disorder of truth." That evening, Poirot wrote a final note for the notary Valfort. "Monsieur, the Darcy lineage doesn't end with a signature, but with an election. I beg you to keep this latest discovery confidential. Not to hide it, but to honour what refused to be claimed." He signed his usual elaborate signature. Then he turned off the lamp and leaned back in his chair, crossing his hands over his chest. The pieces were finally all on the board, and the game over. Chapter 14. The Son Who Chose Not to Be an Heir. A serene rain fell over the open fields of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, blurring the horizon and enveloping the landscape in a melancholic mist. From the window of his room at the Vieux Mole Inn, Hercule Poirot silently watched the drops run down the glass, forming sinuous lines that branched like human decisions. Some met, others were lost. The Darcy family case had come to a close. And yet Poirot remained there a few more days, not out of necessity, out of respect, because the truth, when revealed, doesn't always liberate immediately. Sometimes it needs to be accompanied, like a guest who doesn't dare leave alone. Claire Vernier arrived at the inn one afternoon, wearing a light-coloured coat and a plain-brimmed hat. She was carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted to see you one last time before you leave, Monsieur Poirot," she said, with a smile that, for the first time, did not hide sadness. Poirot invited her to sit by the fire. She placed the package on the table, but didn't open it immediately. "I received an anonymous letter this morning," he said, lowering his voice. "It just said, 'Not all children need to be recognized to be fair.'" Poirot was not surprised. "Inspector," Lemoine Claire nodded. "Did you know? I deduced it," he replied gently. "Life is a curious thing, mademoiselle. 2 sons of the same man, hidden from the world, growing up without knowledge of each other, without demanding anything, and yet both correcting their father's faults, each in their own way." She pulled the ribbon off the package and unfolded it. It was an old-fashioned green-covered notebook, the kind of journal used in schools decades ago. "I found it among my mother's things. I'd never read it before. I didn't dare." Poirot took it with great care. On the first page, in small, delicate handwriting, it read, "For him, for the day he wants to know." Claire continued, "I've just read it. It's more of a collection of memories than a diary. But one thing is very clear. My mother didn't want justice. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted it to be known that she loved, that she didn't run away out of fear, but for protection." Poirot stroked the cover of the notebook. "Then you've honoured her wish. By not claiming what was hers, you've restored to your mother the dignity that was taken from her. And yet," Claire added with a sigh, "I feel like there's still a story untold." Poirot tilted his head. "The inspector's?" Claire shook her head gently. "No, Lord Darcy's. All this time we've been talking about others. Margaret, André, Annette, me. But what about him? Who was he, really?" Poirot took a moment before answering. "A man torn between his family name and his conscience. between the society that demanded perfection from him and the life that gave him a mistake that was his only act of courage. He didn't know how to live with it, but he tried in the end to fix it. Claire put away the diary. Then I'll remember him like that, not as a coward, but as a man who late, but not too late, chose wisely. The next day, Poirot and Hastings boarded the train back to Paris. As they travelled through green fields and forgotten stations, Poirot took an envelope from his inside pocket. "Another letter?" Hastings asked. "The last piece," replied Poirot, handing it to him. Inside was a letter from the notary Valfort, reporting that after reviewing the oldest archives of the Darcy family, a forgotten clause had been discovered. A bank account opened in Geneva with regular deposits until 1928 in the name of Henrielle. Lord Darcy apparently didn't completely abandon Hélène, Poirot said. He continued to support her financially long after he had severed all visible ties. So, guilt or responsibility? Sometimes, Hastings, the difference between the two is simply whether you act in time. The train disappeared into the hills. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment as the clatter of the carriages set a hypnotic rhythm. Behind them were the Darcys, Claires, Lemoines, and the ghosts they each dragged along. Ahead, as always, new questions awaited, and he, Hercule Poirot, was still willing to face them, one deduction at a time. Chapter 15. The House That Wasn't on Any Map. 2 weeks after his return to Paris, Poirot received an unexpected visitor while reading the newspaper in his favourite armchair. It was an elegant but discreet envelope, with no return address. Inside, a single handwritten sheet of paper. "Mr. Poirot, my name is Adeline Marchand. I've been a nurse for 30 years, and now live in retirement on a small estate on the outskirts of Bayeux. Perhaps the name Darcy still rings a bell. I beg you to come. There's something you must see for yourself. Come alone. You won't understand. Issue it unless you see it for yourself." Poirot read the letter 3 times, then held it up to the light. Fine paper, unwatermarked. Firm, unwavering handwriting with a sober bow. The handwriting of someone accustomed to protocol, but not to drama. That intrigued him more than any explicit content. He called Hastings, who would return to Argentina that same week. "My friend, I'm afraid I'll have to read this last chapter, alone. Another secret inheritance, another revealing letter." Poirot closed the letter with a slight sigh. "Maybe, but there's something different about this. Not a crime, maybe, but a missing piece." Bayeux welcomed him with its quiet streets and famous tapestry, but Poirot had no time for sightseeing. He took a rented carriage to the indicated address. A country house surrounded by walnut trees, modest but well kept. Waiting for him, there was a woman with a long face, light eyes, and completely white hair, tied back in a perfect bun. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot," he said without extending his hand. Adeline Marchand led him unceremoniously into an inner room. It was a simple room with a bookshelf, a dressing table, and a single bed. This room belonged to a woman named Annette Delcroix. She died here 3 winters ago. I cared for her during the last years of her life. She asked me not to contact anyone. But when I heard what happened in Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, I knew I had to write to her. Poirot stood beside the bed, observing the invisible traces of someone who had lived and died in silence. "What did he say to you?" Adeline bent down and pulled a flat black velvet box from the shelf. "Not much, but he left me this. He told me that when he died, I should destroy it, or give it to someone who understood the difference between scandal and truth." Poirot opened the box. Inside was a carefully arranged collection of letters, dated between 1907 and 1929. They were all from Lord Alistair Darcy. Some were brief notes, others passionate confessions, some desperate. One spoke of Claire's first birthday, another of a failed attempt to send them away together, and the last was a copy of an unregistered notarial deed. "I, Alistair R. Darcy, declare that I recognize Clarinette Vernier as my legitimate daughter, born February 2nd, 1910. This is my will, although it has no legal force." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. So, he did try to do it, many times, Adeline said. But Margaret made sure to cut off all the avenues. Blackmail, bribed middlemen, even intercepted letters. He tried, believe me. It wasn't just guilt that consumed him. It was helplessness. Poirot put the cards back in their place. And Mrs. Vernier? Did she know about these letters? No, he refused to read them. What doesn't arrive on time is better off never arriving, he once told me. Poirot nodded, and yet here they are. Adeline Marchand extended another sheet, a photograph, Annette in old age with a blanket over her legs, looking at the camera with serene dignity. On the back, scribbled by hand, it read, "I didn't want a name. I just wanted someone to know I existed." Back in Paris, Poirot wrote a letter to Claire. He didn't enclose the letters. He didn't send any documents. He simply wrote, "Miss Claire, I've seen the place where your mother lived in her final years. It was modest, but full of order and tenderness. There, I found proof that your father didn't forget you. Don't seek legal justice. It's no longer necessary. But know that your story wasn't silence. It was choice. And that, mademoiselle, changes everything." Hercule Poirot. That evening, Poirot reviewed no more notes or pending cases. He poured himself a cup of herbal tea, settled into his armchair, and closed his eyes. The story had ended, not with a crime, not with a trial, but with a rescued memory, and that, for him, was justice. Chapter 16. Final Epilogue. A final dedication to Paris, 6 weeks later. Winter had begun to creep into the withered leaves of the chestnut trees on Boulevard Haussmann. In the apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot stood in front of his most personal bookshelf. The one that contained not detective volumes or treatises on criminal psychology, but books of poetry, bound letters, and discreetly framed photographs. On the mantelpiece there was a new addition, a photograph of Annette Delcroix in her old age. To one side, a green-covered notebook, and beside it a small brass plaque with an inscription engraved on Poirot's orders. Sometimes justice is not the revelation of guilt, but the rescue of a forgotten life. That morning, Poirot had sent 2 letters, one to Claire Vernier with a final gesture, and another shorter, more intimate, to a man who had never claimed what was his, Inspector Lemoine. His writing was as precise as it was compassionate. "Mr. Lemoine, I know you don't want recognition, but maybe you do want understanding. Connaissez, fact that you never asked for what was yours isn't weakness, but strength. The Darcy name is linked to yours, not by legal inheritance, but by integrity. And that, believe me, is more enduring than any signature. That same day, Claire Vernier opened her letter in the reading room of the small community library she now diligently ran. Inside, she found a simple piece of paper, handwritten by Poirot. Mademoiselle, as promised, I haven't sent you the documents, not because you aren't entitled to them, but because you've already done what most people never manage, live without resentment. But I do want to give you something else, a dedication, for you and for your mother, in case you ever decide to tell your story, or just quietly remember it. Accompanying the note is an attached sheet, typed in black ink, dedication, to Annette Delcroix, who chose silence without losing dignity, to Claire Vernier, who inherited the truth and did not turn it into a weapon, and to all those who do not appear in the portraits posted, but whose lives were the invisible thread of history. Claire felt her heart flutter as she finished reading. She didn't cry. Instead, she closed the page and placed it in a simple wooden frame, which she hung above the shelf of biographies. No name, no title, just the word, memory. In London, Hastings received a postcard from Poirot. It wasn't a clue, a quote, or even a report, just a sentence. The crime was solved, mon ami, but the mystery was humanity. And below, signed in small rounded letters, H.P. As night fell, Poirot looked out the window of his apartment. The city shone like a constellation within easy reach. He closed the curtains, lit the lamp, and took out a blank sheet of paper. He wrote just one line in the center of the page, end of story, but not of memory. Then he turned off the light and leaned back in his armchair. While Paris slept, Hercule Poirot rested with a clear conscience and, for once, a peaceful soul. Because not all endings need a reveal. Sometimes it's enough your last dedication. Chapter 17. The Trail of the Second Photograph. 2 months after the closure of the Darcy case, as the snow was beginning to melt on the sidewalks of Paris, Hercule Poirot received an unexpected package in his mail. There was no return address, but the postage stamp was from Strasbourg. The package contained only one photograph, an old one. In it, Lord Alistair Darcy, visibly younger, posed with a woman who was not Annette Delcroix. This woman had short hair, thin lips, and a firm, almost inquisitive expression. Behind them, the coat of arms of a school could be seen. On the back of the photograph, in blue ink, a line. If one knew how to look twice, one would see what the first one did not want to show. Poirot, sitting in his armchair, slowly turned the photograph over in his fingers. A warning, a provocation, he murmured, or perhaps an invitation. The next day found him at the National Library, requesting access to the records of former boarding schools and private schools in the Strasbourg region during the First World War. After several hours of searching and cross-referencing records, Poirot found what he was looking for: a list of students and donors registered in 1918 at a school called Saint-Lazare College. There were 2 names listed: Alistair Darcy, private benefactor; Miss Juliette Marchand, professor of philosophy and head of correspondence during the occupation. Poirot tilted his head, puzzled. Marchand. The surname wasn't unfamiliar. Adeline Marchand, the nurse who cared for Annette in her final years. Could she be related? Or was it a coincidence? No, Poirot did not believe in coincidences. Upon his return to Paris, Poirot discreetly requested Adeline's genealogy. His suspicions were confirmed. Juliette Marchand was her maternal aunt, who died in 1942. She never married and, according to records, had retired to live on the same estate where Annette would die decades later. Too close, too quiet. Poirot reflected aloud as he paced around his apartment. If Juliette knew Alistair and her niece looked after Annette, then we're not talking about a single act, but rather a network of protection. A network that lasted for years, even beyond the death of the Darcy patriarch. He took the photograph again. This time, he examined the school crest with a magnifying glass. In the lower left corner, almost imperceptible, was a figure, a falcon carved in bas-relief. Poirot stopped. I had seen that hawk before. 3 years earlier, in a minor case of trafficking in forged documents, Poirot had discovered a discreet society of women who protected the unrecognized children of aristocrats. They called themselves the Silent Ones, and they used a falcon as a symbol, a vigilant, silent, and protective bird. Then he understood Annette did not survive alone. She was protected, helped, and the most remarkable thing was that his daughter, Claire, never knew anything. A secret network, Poirot muttered, not for crime, for justice, not for revenge, for balance. That same afternoon, Poirot wrote a letter to no clear addressee. It simply said, "To those who protected what the law did not want to see, to those who became mothers without permission, to those who gave to others what they never asked for themselves, Hercule Poirot thanks him." He stored the letter in a personal file box, one that had no title, just a white label with 3 handwritten words, "The cases that are not counted." That evening, as it snowed slowly outside, Poirot walked to his desk. He took out his notebook, where he had recorded every phase of the Darcy case, and added one last note. The case is closed, but its echo does not cease. Some mysteries are not solved with a confession, but with a look in the opposite direction than expected. Sometimes the noblest secrets are the ones that are never fully revealed. And with that, he closed the notebook. For now, Chapter 18, The Silent Legacy. A week after discovering the link between Juliette Marchand, the Silent Ones, and the untold story of Annette Delcroix, Hercule Poirot made an unusual decision. He travelled back to Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, not out of professional duty, but out of emotional necessity. There was a final chapter that couldn't be written from a distance. He arrived at the Darcy mansion at dusk. The long shadows of the cypress trees fell across the facade, but the house, for the first time, didn't seem imposing. There was something surrendered about it, like an old actor who, after the curtain had fallen, accepted that the play was over. Claire Vernier was waiting for him in the library, by the same fire before which Lord Darcy had often read in his final days. She was dressed in dark blue, unadorned, but with the same firm composure that Poirot had learned to recognize as a direct inheritance from his mother. "I didn't expect you to come back, Monsieur Poirot." "Nor I," he replied, taking a seat. "But there's something I still have to share with you. Not as a detective, but as a witness." Claire frowned gently. Poirot took a carefully folded sheet of paper from his inside coat pocket. A typewritten transcript of a letter from Juliette Marchand, found in a forgotten Strasbourg archive, sealed by an old society. "Your mother wasn't alone, mademoiselle. From the moment she ran away, she was helped, protected, first by Juliette, then by other women like her. They were part of a clandestine group that assisted women rejected by the aristocracy. It wasn't a conspiracy, but a protection network." Claire opened the letter and read it silently for several minutes. When she finished, she dropped her hands to her lap, speechless. Her face didn't show surprise, but something deeper, a calmness settled on shaky ground. So, it wasn't just her. It wasn't just fear. It was a collective decision. Exactly. Your mother chose silence, yes, but it was a controlled silence. It wasn't cowardice, mademoiselle. It was dignity orchestrated by invisible hands. Claire nodded slowly. "And you? Do you think I should tell you?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Only if you need to. The value of a story doesn't lie in its public exposure, but in knowing when it shouldn't remain hidden." Claire folded the letter again and put it in her purse. "Then I'll keep it, not out of shame, out of respect." Before leaving, Poirot walked alone through the gardens. Winter had left them bare, but beneath the soil, he knew well, new roots were growing. He paused before the central statue, a faceless angel that Lord Darcy had commissioned in his youth. He had forgotten who it represented. Poirot, however, no longer had any doubts. It was Annette, not in marble, but in memory. Back in Paris, Poirot prepared his final report on the case. It would not be given to any police, the press, or even the notary Valfort. He titled it soberly, "Confidential Report. Darcy Case, not to be published." His final summary was brief. The case began with a note under the deceased's pillow, and it ended with the restored memory of someone who was never recorded in official records. 2 children were discovered, both hidden for different reasons. One chose silence out of duty. The other chose it out of forgiveness. The original culprit was fear. Justice was recognition. No one was arrested, but everyone was, in a way, released, signed Hercule Poirot. He filed the report away in a box with other unresolved stories, and then he did something unusual. He lit a candle in front of his mother's portrait and murmured softly, "Mother, this story wasn't mine. But today, more than ever, I understand what it means to love from the margins." Days later, a letter arrived. At her door, no return address. A single line. "Thank you for giving me back something I never knew was taken from me." It was signed with an initial. Poirot read it silently. He placed it next to his bound copy of the Book of Truth, and closed his eyes for a moment. The case of the note under the dead man's pillow was over. Not with punishment, not with scandal, but with restoration. And for Hercule Poirot, that was the closest thing to perfection.